Hey guys, we are going to read chapters 2 and 3 of Tuck Everlasting today. Yesterday we got started by reading the prologue and chapter 1, and as you'll remember in class, I always like to take a look back and just remind ourselves what we read so that when we're ready to go forward, we're kind of fresh. So we're going to take a look back in the prologue in chapter 1. If you miss it, you have this attachment, and that's my video and everything. So we went through the prologue. The one thing that kind of jumped out at me in the prologue was it talked about how one day at that time, not so very long ago, 3 things happened. And at first there appeared to be no connection between them. And I feel like this is the author foreshadowing that we really need to pay attention when it starts talking about these 3 things. So the first of those was, at dawn, May Tuck set out on her horse for the wood at the edge of the village of Tree Gap. She's been going there, as she did once every 10 years, to meet her 2 sons, Miles and Jesse. Then, at noontime, Winnie Foster, whose family owned the Tree Gap wood, lost her patience at last and decided to think about running away. So remember, Winnie Foster's the little girl in the Foster family? Only little girl, and she lives in that touch-me-not cottage that looks kind of like a dollhouse, and she just never went outside of the gate around her house. Again, as country kids, we feel like that sounds weird because we grew up in the woods and we grew up building forts and doing things like that, but she was just never curious about any of that. So she's going to lose her patience and she's going to think about running away. And the last one is right here. And at sunset, a stranger appeared at the Foster's gate. He was looking for someone, but he didn't say who. So we have to kind of keep our eyes peeled for the stranger. So, then in chapter 1, we talked a little bit more about the woods and all of that. And at the very last part of this, it said, that road that goes around the woods. So the woods has kind of always been preserved, and they said in the center of the wood, there's this huge ash tree. And at the bottom of it, there's a little burbling spring, and somebody had put rocks on top of that spring, looking like they didn't want anybody to notice what that spring was holding. And so here it said, if the people would have noticed the tree, they would have noticed the spring and the pebbles piled there to conceal it. Conceal means to hide. And that would have been a disaster so immense that this weary old earth, owned or not to its fiery core, would have trembled on its axis like a beetle on a pin. So it kind of left us with more questions than we had answers. So today, we're going to jump into chapters 2 and 3. In the book, it's about 7 pages long, so it's not a terribly long reading. Might feel a little longer online. I'm not quite sure how it'll work out, but we're going to do these 2 chapters today. Chapter 2. And so, at dawn, that day in the first week of August, May Tuck woke up and lay for a while beaming at the cobwebs on the ceiling. At last she said aloud, "The boys will be home tomorrow." May's husband, on his back beside her, did not stir. He was still asleep, and the melancholy creases that folded his daytime face were smooth and slacked. He snored gently, and for a moment the corners of his mouth turned upward in a smile. Tuck almost never smiled, except in his sleep. May sat up in bed and looked at him tolerantly. "The boys will be home tomorrow," she said again, a little more loudly. Tuck twitched, and the smile vanished. His eyes opened. "Why'd you have to wake me?" he sighed. "I was having that dream again, the good one, where we're all in heaven and never heard a Tree Gap." May sat there frowning, a great potato of a woman, with a round, sensible face and calm brown eyes. "It's no use having that dream," she said. "Nothing's going to change." "You tell me that every day," said Tuck, turning away and onto his side. "Anyways, I can't help what I dream." "Maybe not," said May, "but all the same, you should have got used to things by now." Tuck groaned. "I'm going back to sleep," he said. "Not me," said May. "I'm going to take the horse and go down to the wood to meet them." "Meet who?" "The boys, Tuck, our sons. I'm going to ride down to meet them." "Better not do that," said Tuck. "I know," said May, "but I just can't wait to see them. Anyways, It's 10 years since I went to Tree Gap. No one'll remember me. I'll ride in at sunset just to the wood. I won't go into the village, but even if someone did see me, they won't remember. They never did before, now, did they?" "Suit yourself, then," said Tuck into his pillow. "I'm going back to sleep." May Tuck climbed out of bed and began to dress. 3 petticoats, a rusty brown skirt with one enormous pocket, an old cotton jacket, and a knitted shawl which she pinned across her bosom with a tarnished metal brooch. The sounds of her dressing were so familiar to Tuck that he could say without opening his eyes, "You don't need that shawl in the middle of the summer." May ignored this observation. Instead, she said, "Will you be all right? We won't get back till late tomorrow." Tuck rolled over and made a rueful face at her. "What in the world could possibly happen to me?" "That's so," said May. "I keep forgetting." "I don't," said Tuck. "Have a nice time." And in a moment he was asleep again. May sat on the edge of the bed and pulled on a pair of short leather boots so thin and soft with age it was a wonder they held together. Then she stood and took from the washstand beside the bed a little square-shaped object, a music box painted with roses and lilies of the valley. It was the one pretty thing she owned, and she never went anywhere without it. Her fingers strayed to the winding key on its bottom, but glancing at the sleeping Tuck, she shook her head, gave the little box a pat, and dropped it into her pocket. Then, last of all, she pulled down over her ears a blue straw hat with a drooping, exhausted brim. But before she put on the hat, she brushed her gray-brown hair and wound it into a bun at the back of her neck. She did this quickly and skillfully without a single glance in the mirror. May Tuck didn't need a mirror, though she had one propped up on the washstand. She knew very well what she would see in it. Her reflection had long since ceased to interest her, for May Tuck and her husband, and Miles and Jessie too, had all looked exactly the same for 87 years. So that's kind of an odd way to end the chapter. So she looks the exact same for 87 years. Think of all the changes that have gone on in 87 years just in the world. And we know now that this is not some kind of regular thing. Also, I noticed that she was riding horse to go places. I don't know if that means that that's their only mode of transportation, but it's looking to me like it takes place maybe more back in the olden days. Because there was no mention of the TV and anything like that that we would feel like were normal things in the morning. So I feel like the setting is set maybe back years ago. All right, we're going to continue to chapter 3. At noontime of that same day in the first week of August, Winnie Foster sat on the bristly grass just inside the fence and said to the large toad who was squatting a few yards away across the road, "I will, though, you'll see, maybe even first thing tomorrow, while everyone's still asleep." It was hard to know whether the toad was listening or not. Certainly, Winnie had given it a good reason to ignore her. She had come out to the fence, very cross, very near the boiling point on a day that was itself near to boiling, and had noticed the toad at once. It was the only living thing in sight except for a stationary cloud of hysterical gnats suspended in the heat above the road. Winnie had found some pebbles at the base of the fence, and, for lack of any other way to show how she felt, she had flung one at the toad. It missed altogether, as she fully intended it should, but she made a game of it anyway, tossing pebbles at such an angle that passed through the gnat cloud on their way to the toad. The gnats were too frantic to notice these intrusions, however, and since every pebble missed its final mark, the toad continued to squat and grimace without so much as a twitch. Possibly it felt resentful, or perhaps it was only asleep. In either case, it gave her an odd glance, and when at last she ran out of pebbles and sat down to tell it her troubles. "Look here, Toad," she said, thrusting her arms through the bars of the fence and plucking out the weeds on the other side. "I don't think I can stand it much longer." At that moment, a window at the front of the cottage was flung open, and a thin voice, her grandmother's, piped, "Winifred, don't sit on that dirty grass. You'll stain your boots and stockings." Another, firmer voice, her mother's, added, Come in now, Winnie, right away. You'll get heat stroke out there on a day like this, and your lunch is ready." "See," said Winnie to the toad, "that's just what I mean. It's like that every minute. If I had a sister or a brother, there'd be someone else for them to watch. But, as it is, there's only me. I'm tired of being looked at all the time. I want to be by myself for a change." She leaned her forehead against the bars and after a short silence went on in a thoughtful tone. "I'm not exactly sure what I'd do, but something interesting. Something that's all mine. Something that would make some kind of difference in the world. It'd be nice to have a new name to start with, one that's not all worn out from being called so much, and I might even decide to have a pet. Maybe a big old toad like you, that I could keep in a nice cage with lots of grass and—" At this, the toad stirred and blinked. It gave a heave of muscles, and it plopped its heavy mud ball of a body a few inches farther away from her. "I suppose you're right," said Winnie. "Then you'd be just the way I am now. Why should you have to be cooped up in a cage too? It'd be better if I could be like you, out in the open, and making up my own mind. Do you know they've hardly ever let me out of this yard all by myself? I'll never be able to do anything important if I stay here like this. I expect I'd better run away." She paused and peered anxiously at the toad to see how it would receive this staggering idea, but it showed no signs of interest. "You think I won't dare, don't you?" she said accusingly. "I will, though. You'll see. Maybe even first thing in the morning, while everyone's still asleep." "Winnie!" came the firm voice from the window. "All right, I'm coming," she cried, exasperated, and then added quickly, I'll be right there, Mamma." She stood up, brushing at her legs where bits of itchy grass clung to her stockings. The toad, as if it saw that their interview was over, stirred again, bunched up, and bounced itself clumsily off toward the wood. Winnie watched it go. "Hop away, Toad," she called after it. "You'll see. Just wait till morning." And that ends Chapter 3. Now you're going to go into Google Classroom and answer the question that I have posted and make sure that you're commenting on what other people are thinking. So I don't know. We'll see if Winnie Foster actually decides to run away. Have a good day.